Records buried in the Beaufort County Courthouse mention a plantation that operated under a system so disturbing, local officials tried to erase its existence from public documents after the Civil War. For 23 years, between 1835 and 1858, the Harrington family plantation operated what neighboring landowners privately called the breeding operation, a systematic program where the plantation owner, his wife, and all 5 of their children participated in forced reproduction with enslaved people to maximize profit and secure generational wealth. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just what happened, but how methodically it was planned, how willingly the entire family participated, and how completely the surrounding community chose to look away. The Harrington ledgers, discovered in a locked trunk in 1962, documented everything with the cold precision of livestock records, except these were human beings. Before we continue with the story of the Harrington plantation and how an entire family convinced themselves that breeding human beings like cattle was simply good business, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And please leave a comment telling us what state or city you're watching from. Now let's go back to South Carolina in 1835 to understand how this horror began. Beaufort County, South Carolina in 1835 was cotton country, where fortunes rose and fell with each harvest. The Harrington plantation sat on 1,200 acres of rich delta soil, about 8 miles northeast of Port Royal, the county seat. Ezekiel Harrington had purchased the land in 1829 with inheritance money from his father, a tobacco merchant from North Carolina who had made considerable profit supplying Confederate forces during various conflicts. Ezekiel was 31 years old when he bought the property, newly married to Abigail Cavendish, daughter of a plantation owner from Georgia. Abigail was 23, educated in Savannah, and came from a family that had operated a large rice plantation for 3 generations. The Harrington plantation grew cotton primarily, but also maintained vegetable gardens, a small orchard, and livestock. By 1835, Ezekiel owned 42 enslaved people, a modest number compared to the largest plantations in the area, but substantial enough to mark him as a man of means. The plantation house was a 2-story structure, with white columns built in the Greek Revival style that was popular among wealthy Southerners of that era. 6 bedrooms upstairs, a large dining room, a study for Ezekiel, and a parlor where Abigail entertained the wives of other plantation owners. Ezekiel and Abigail had married in 1830, and their first child, William, was born in 1831. Then came Benjamin in 1833, Catherine in 1835, Edward in 1837, and finally Victoria in 1839. 5 children in 8 years. Abigail managed the household with the help of enslaved domestic workers, while Ezekiel spent his days overseeing the fields, traveling to Charleston to conduct business, and maintaining relationships with cotton brokers and other plantation owners. To anyone observing from the outside, the Harringtons appeared to be a typical, wealthy plantation family of the antebellum South. They attended church every Sunday at the Port Royal Presbyterian congregation. Ezekiel served on the county agricultural board. Abigail participated in ladies' charitable societies. Their children received education from a private tutor, a man named Henry Caldwell from Tennessee, who lived in a cottage on the property and taught the Harrington children reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. But inside the plantation house, behind closed doors, Ezekiel and Abigail were having conversations that would have shocked even the hardened sensibilities of their slave-owning neighbors. Ezekiel had become obsessed with a particular problem that plagued many plantation owners: the constant need to purchase new enslaved workers. Prices had been climbing steadily throughout the 1830s. A healthy adult male field worker could cost anywhere from $800 to $1,200, a significant investment. When enslaved people became too old to work or died from disease or injury, that investment was lost. Ezekiel spent hours in his study, poring over his account books, calculating expenses, projecting future costs. Abigail, who had grown up watching her father manage a large plantation, understood the economics of slavery as well as any man. Her father had always maintained that the most profitable plantations were those that could grow their own workforce, meaning encouraging reproduction among enslaved people to create new workers without the expense of purchase. This was common practice throughout the South, but the Cavendish plantation had taken it further. Abigail's father had systematically paired enslaved people he believed were strong or healthy, sometimes separating families to create what he believed would be optimal breeding pairs. Abigail brought these ideas to her marriage, but Ezekiel wanted to go further. During the winter of 1834, when Abigail was pregnant with Catherine, Ezekiel proposed something to his wife that would shape the next 2 decades of their lives and the lives of everyone on their plantation. He suggested that instead of merely encouraging reproduction among enslaved people, they should directly participate in it themselves. His reasoning, as he explained it to Abigail, was purely economic. The children born from such unions would be enslaved by law, following the condition of the mother, but would carry Harrington blood, which Ezekiel believed would make them stronger, healthier, and more valuable.
These children could be kept to work the plantation or sold at premium prices. Either way, it would be, in his words, investing in our future prosperity. Abigail did not reject the idea immediately. She thought about it for several weeks. She prayed about it, she later told her children. She consulted the account books. She remembered her father's methods, and eventually she agreed. But she added one condition. Their children would be raised knowing this was their duty, their contribution to family prosperity. When the time came, all of them would participate. The family would operate as a unit, maximizing production, ensuring the plantation's success for generations. This was not a decision born from sadism or perversion, though the results would be horrific. This was calculated, methodical economic planning dressed up as family duty, and once Abigail agreed, they began preparing their children for what would be expected of them. William Harrington was only 3 years old when his parents began his education. He could not have understood the full implications of what he was being taught, but the lessons started early. Ezekiel and Abigail spoke openly at the dinner table about the enslaved people on the plantation as property, as investments, as breeding stock. They used the same language they used when discussing horses or cattle. William heard this language from his earliest memories. It became normal to him. By the time William was 8 years old in 1839, he understood what would be expected of him when he came of age. His father explained it during one of their walks around the plantation. William would help grow the workforce. It was a son's duty to contribute to family prosperity. Ezekiel framed it as responsibility, as maturity, as the mark of a man ready to take his place in managing the family enterprise. Benjamin received the same education. So did Edward. The girls, Catherine and Victoria, were taught differently, but with the same end goal. Abigail explained to them that bearing children was a woman's purpose, and that bearing children who would increase family wealth was the highest purpose of all. She taught them that enslaved women were beneath them in all ways, and that using them for family benefit was no different than using them to cook meals or wash clothes. They were tools, resources. The children grew up isolated. They had few friends outside the family. Their tutor, Henry Caldwell, taught them reading and mathematics, but the truly formative education came from their parents. By 1845, William was 14, Benjamin was 12, Catherine was 10, Edward was 8, and Victoria was 6. The household operated on a strict schedule, meals at the same time every day, church on Sundays, work during the week. Ezekiel increasingly involved William in plantation management, teaching him to inspect the fields, to evaluate the health and productivity of enslaved workers, to think always in terms of profit and loss. The Harrington children did not question what they were taught, because they knew nothing else. They had no outside perspective, no contrary voice. Their tutor never challenged Ezekiel's authority. The Presbyterian minister who visited the plantation saw only a prosperous, well-ordered household. Other plantation families who interacted with the Harringtons noticed nothing unusual, or if they did, they said nothing. The culture of the antebellum South was one of privacy regarding what happened on a man's own property. What a plantation owner did with his enslaved people was his business. On a humid evening in May of 1848, when William turned 17, Ezekiel called him into the study after dinner. Abigail was there, sitting in the corner chair. William sat across from his father's desk. Ezekiel explained that William was now a man, and it was time for him to fulfill his duty to the family. A young woman named Lydia, who was 20 years old and worked in the kitchen, had been selected. She would be brought to William's room that night. William did not refuse. He had been prepared for this moment his entire life. It was expected. It was duty. That night marked the beginning of the systematic breeding program that would define the Harrington plantation for the next decade. Lydia became pregnant within 3 months. She gave birth to a boy in May of 1849. Ezekiel recorded the birth in his ledger with satisfaction. He named the child Isaac, wrote "Property of Harrington Plantation" next to the entry, and estimated the child's future value at maturity. Lydia was returned to kitchen work within 2 weeks of giving birth. The baby was cared for by an older enslaved woman named Miriam, who had raised many of the enslaved children on the plantation. William continued his duties. Over the next 3 years, he fathered 4 more children with 3 different enslaved women. Benjamin began his participation in 1850, when he turned 17. Edward began in 1854. The daughters, Catherine and Victoria, were expected to bear children as well, but in their case, the father would be enslaved men, selected by Ezekiel for what he considered desirable physical characteristics: strength, health, good teeth, clear eyes. Catherine turned 18 in 1853. Abigail spent months preparing her psychologically for what was coming. Catherine did not resist. She had been taught her whole life that this was normal, expected, righteous even. An enslaved man named Marcus, who was 25 years old and worked as a blacksmith on the plantation, was brought to Catherine's room on a Saturday night. Catherine became pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter in August of 1854. Abigail insisted that Catherine continue her participation. Over the next 4 years, Catherine had 3 more children. Victoria followed the same pattern when she turned 18 in 1857. By that point, the system was well established. The family operated with cold efficiency. Ezekiel maintained meticulous records. Abigail managed the household and supervised the pregnancies and births.
The sons performed their assigned duties. The daughters bore children. The enslaved people had no voice, no choice, no escape. What made the Harrington operation particularly disturbing was not just the forced reproduction, but the systematic nature of it. Ezekiel treated it like agriculture. He rotated which enslaved women were paired with his sons to avoid what he called overuse of any individual. He tracked menstrual cycles. He provided better food rations to pregnant women, not out of compassion, but to ensure healthy births. He separated mothers from children at age 3, believing that early separation prevented emotional bonds that might interfere with productivity. The plantation ledgers from this period, which survived and were eventually discovered, are chilling in their detail. Each birth is recorded with the mother's name, the date, the child's sex, any notable physical characteristics, and an estimated future value. The children fathered by Ezekiel himself, and he did participate beginning in 1850, when William had proven the viability of the system, are marked with a small notation in the margin, H, direct line. These children, Ezekiel believed, would command the highest prices if sold, or would be the most productive if kept. By 1855, the plantation population had grown from 42 to 68. 26 of those were children under the age of 10, all born as part of the breeding program. The Harrington family wealth increased substantially. Ezekiel expanded his land holdings, purchasing an adjacent 300 acres. He built a new barn, a cotton gin building, and additional slave quarters to house the growing population. He was considered one of the most successful planters in Beaufort County. Life on the Harrington plantation followed a brutal rhythm. The field workers rose before dawn, worked until dark, returned to their cabins exhausted. The house servants worked slightly shorter hours, but were under constant supervision. Children born into slavery on the plantation were put to light work by age 5, carrying water, picking vegetables, running errands. By age 10, they were in the fields or learning trades. The family grew, but families were not allowed to truly form. Ezekiel's policy of early separation meant that mothers and children spent only the first 3 years together, and even during that time, the mothers were working. The older woman, Miriam, who cared for the youngest children, did her best to provide some maternal comfort, but she was managing a dozen infants and toddlers at any given time. The psychological impact on the enslaved people was profound, though their suffering was not recorded in Ezekiel's ledgers. They lived in constant fear, constant vigilance, knowing that any woman of childbearing age could be selected, that any child born would be taken, that resistance meant punishment or death. Some tried to resist. A woman named Esther attempted to run away in 1851 after being forced to bear her 3rd child, fathered by Benjamin Harrington. She made it 17 miles before being captured by a slave patrol. She was returned to the plantation, whipped publicly as punishment, and locked in a small storage shed for 2 weeks with minimal food and water. When she was released, she no longer spoke. She worked silently for the rest of her life, died of pneumonia in 1863, and was buried in the unmarked section of the plantation cemetery. The Harrington children, William, Benjamin, Catherine, Edward, and Victoria, all participated in the system their parents created, but they were not identical in their responses. William, the oldest, seemed to accept his role with little visible emotional conflict. He managed sections of the plantation, oversaw field work, conducted business in town, and fathered children with enslaved women as directed. He married a woman named Virginia Langley from a neighboring plantation in 1853, but this did not change his participation in the breeding program. Virginia either did not know the full extent of what occurred on the Harrington plantation, or she chose not to acknowledge it. Benjamin, the second son, showed signs of distress as early as 1852. He began drinking heavily, often disappearing for days at a time. Ezekiel punished him for neglecting duties, but Benjamin's drinking only worsened. By 1855, he was functional, but clearly miserable, speaking little, avoiding eye contact with both family and enslaved people. He never married. He continued his participation in the breeding program until 1858, but with increasingly erratic behavior. Catherine, after the birth of her 4th child in 1857, began experiencing what Abigail described in letters to her sister as melancholic episodes. Catherine would lock herself in her room for days, refusing meals, speaking to no one. Abigail treated this as a temporary weakness that required discipline, not sympathy. Catherine was not permitted to stop her participation. She had a 5th child in 1859, shortly before the breeding program began to collapse. Edward and Victoria, the youngest, had grown up so thoroughly immersed in the system that they seemed to view it as completely normal. They participated without visible hesitation when their time came. This total acceptance might have been the most disturbing aspect of all, demonstrating how completely a person could be shaped by their environment, how thoroughly an evil practice could be normalized. But cracks were beginning to show. The enslaved population of the plantation had grown too large for the existing infrastructure. Housing was crowded. Food rations, though adequate by the standards of the time, were stretched thin. More significantly, the children fathered by the Harrington family were becoming old enough to understand their parentage. By 1857, some of these children were 8 or 9 years old enough to wonder why they looked different from other enslaved children, why they had lighter skin or different hair texture.
The older enslaved people on the plantation told them the truth quietly in the privacy of the quarters after dark. This created an atmosphere of resentment and tension that even Ezekiel's strict discipline could not completely suppress. The enslaved people knew which children belonged to which family member. They knew the system, they hated it, but they were powerless to stop it. And any organized resistance would result in brutal punishment or sale to plantations further south where conditions were even worse. Neighboring plantation owners began to notice things. The Harrington plantation population had grown unusually quickly. The demographics were odd. Too many young children in proportion to adults. A few whispered conversations occurred among plantation wives about Abigail Harrington's daughters and their unexplained pregnancies before marriage. But this was the antebellum South, where social cohesion among the white planter class was maintained by silence on uncomfortable topics. As long as the Harringtons conducted themselves appropriately in public, which they did, no one would confront them directly. Ezekiel himself seemed immune to any moral qualms. His letters from this period, some of which survived in family collections, discussed plantation management with other owners, cotton prices, political developments, and various business matters. He mentions the success of his breeding program in economic terms only, comparing his results to those achieved with livestock breeding. There is no indication of guilt, no moment of doubt, no recognition that he was committing profound evil. He had created a mental framework in which enslaved people were not fully human, and within that framework, his actions were logical, even commendable. He was being a good steward of his resources. He was building generational wealth for his family. Abigail's perspective, glimpsed through occasional letters she wrote to her sister in Georgia, was similar. She worried about her children's health and futures, but these worries were purely practical. Whether William would successfully inherit the plantation, whether Benjamin's drinking would become a serious problem, whether the daughters would eventually marry well. Despite their participation in the breeding program, she never expressed concern for the enslaved women who were being raped, or the children being born into bondage, or the psychological damage being done to everyone involved. In her worldview, enslaved people were property, tools, and their suffering was irrelevant. The absolute moral blindness of the Harrington family was not unique to them. Thousands of plantation owners throughout the South operated under similar assumptions. What made the Harringtons unusual was the systematic involvement of the entire family, the multi-generational planning, the cold calculation. Most forced reproduction on plantations was opportunistic, driven by individual owners' exploitation of enslaved women. The Harrington program was different. It was organized, methodical, a family business. The year 1858 brought changes that would begin to unravel the system Ezekiel and Abigail had built. In February, Henry Caldwell, the tutor who had educated the Harrington children for more than 2 decades, died suddenly of a heart condition. He was 57 years old. His death meant the family lost someone who, through his silence, had enabled their operation. Caldwell had known. He had lived on the plantation for years, had seen the pattern, had observed the growing number of mixed-race children. He had never said anything to anyone outside the plantation. His complicity through silence was as damaging as active participation. After Caldwell's death, Ezekiel decided the younger children no longer needed formal tutoring. Victoria, at 19, was considered educated enough. Edward, at 21, was already managing significant portions of the plantation. The family could operate without an outsider living on the property. This decision increased their isolation even further. In April, an enslaved woman named Lila, who was 32 years old and had borne 5 children as part of the breeding program, fell severely ill with what was probably tuberculosis, though it was not diagnosed as such at the time.
She coughed blood, ran high fevers, lost weight rapidly. Abigail, concerned about the potential for disease to spread through the enslaved population, ordered Lila isolated in a small cabin at the far edge of the quarters. Lila died 3 weeks later, alone, separated from her children. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave. Lila's death affected the enslaved community deeply. She had been well-liked, had quietly provided comfort to other women forced into the breeding program, had sung hymns in the evenings that could be heard across the quarters. Her death and burial, rushed, unmarked with no ceremony, was seen as an indication of her worthlessness in the eyes of the Harrington family. Anger simmered. That summer, the cotton crop suffered from boll weevil infestation, reducing yield significantly. Ezekiel's income dropped. He needed to sell some of the enslaved children who were now old enough to work to raise cash. In August, he sold 6 children, ranging in age from 8 to 12, to a slave trader who transported them to Georgia. 4 of those children had been fathered by his sons. He separated them from their mothers without ceremony, loading them into a wagon early one morning and sending them away. The mothers were not permitted to say goodbye. This event broke something in the enslaved community. The passive acceptance that had characterized the previous decade gave way to quiet rage. The enslaved people began talking among themselves about the possibility of escape, about the rumors they had heard of the Underground Railroad, about the increasing tensions between North and South over slavery. Some of the younger men talked about violence, about rebellion, though the older people cautioned against it.
The memory of the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831 and its brutal suppression was still fresh in Southern collective memory. Open rebellion meant death. Benjamin Harrington's drinking reached a crisis point in September. He was found unconscious in the barn one afternoon, having consumed most of a bottle of whiskey. Ezekiel had him carried to the house, berated him when he regained consciousness, and threatened to disinherit him if the behavior continued. Benjamin promised to reform, but the promise was empty. His nightly drinking continued. He began to neglect plantation duties entirely. William had to take over Benjamin's responsibilities. Catherine's mental state also deteriorated. In October, after the birth of her 5th child, a son she was not permitted to keep, who was taken from her after 3 days and given to Miriam to raise, Catherine attempted to harm herself. The specific method was never recorded, but Abigail's letter to her sister mentioned that Catherine had been prevented from a rash action and was being closely supervised. Catherine was confined to her room for 3 weeks under Abigail's watch. When she emerged, she was pale, thin, and hollow-eyed. She spoke only when directly addressed. She moved through the house like a ghost. The emotional and psychological strain on the Harrington family was becoming visible, but they could not or would not acknowledge its source. Ezekiel attributed Benjamin's drinking to weakness of character. Abigail attributed Catherine's depression to female hysteria. Neither connected their children's suffering to the monstrous system they had created and enforced. The fundamental premise that enslaved people were property and could be used however the family saw fit remained unquestioned. In November, a traveling Methodist minister stayed overnight at the plantation while passing through the county. His name was Reverend Thomas Blackwell, and he was from Ohio, traveling through the South to observe conditions and report back to his congregation. He ate dinner with the family, said grace, engaged in polite conversation, but he noticed things. He observed the unusual number of young children in the slave quarters, noted the physical similarities between some of those children and the Harrington family, saw the haunted look in Catherine's eyes and the drunken glaze in Benjamin's. Reverend Blackwell did not confront the family directly. That would have been socially impossible and potentially dangerous. But after he left the plantation the next morning, he made notes in a journal he kept. Those notes survived. They describe his suspicions about what was occurring on the Harrington plantation in the 1850s, his horror at the implications, and his sense of helplessness. What could he do? He was a Northerner with no authority in South Carolina. Slavery itself was legal. Even if he reported his suspicions to local authorities, they would do nothing. Plantation owners had almost absolute control over their enslaved people.
As long as they did not murder them outright, and even that was rarely prosecuted, they faced no consequences. Reverend Blackwell's account, published years later in a collection of testimonies about slavery, is one of the few external confirmations that something deeply disturbing was happening on the Harrington plantation in the 1850s. He described the atmosphere as oppressive beyond the usual oppression of slavery, and noted that the enslaved people I observed seemed to live in a state of terror that went beyond normal fear of punishment. December brought cold weather and the end of the cotton harvest. The reduced yield meant financial pressure on Ezekiel. He spent long hours in his study reviewing accounts, calculating how to maintain profitability. His solution was to intensify the breeding program further. He instructed William and Edward to increase their participation. He selected 3 additional enslaved women he considered suitable. He set targets, a specific number of births he wanted to achieve in the coming year. On Christmas Day, the Harrington family attended church in Port Royal, as they did every Sunday and major holiday. They sat in their usual pew, sang hymns, listened to the sermon. The minister, Reverend James Whittaker, spoke about duty, family, and Christian virtue. The Harringtons nodded in agreement. After the service, they socialized with other plantation families on the church lawn. Abigail discussed recipes and household management with other women. Ezekiel talked politics with other men. The children stood quietly, well-dressed and well-behaved. To every observer, they appeared to be a model family. That afternoon, back at the plantation, Ezekiel gathered the family in the parlor. He announced his plans to expand the breeding program in the coming year. He explained his expectations for each family member. He emphasized the importance of productivity, of maximizing returns, of ensuring the plantation's prosperity. His tone was businesslike, as if he were discussing crop rotation or equipment maintenance. The children listened. Even Benjamin, despite his drinking, nodded acceptance. This was their normal. This was what they had been taught their entire lives. But something was shifting. The slaves in the quarters had begun quietly organizing. A man named Elias, who was 26 years old and had been born on the plantation, had been making contact with enslaved people on neighboring plantations during Sunday church services, when plantation slaves were sometimes permitted to attend. He gathered information about possible escape routes, about sympathetic whites who might help, about the tensions brewing between North and South that might present opportunities. He shared this information carefully, only with people he trusted completely, knowing that one informant could destroy everyone.
The stage was set for confrontation. The Harrington family believed they were in complete control, that their system was functioning smoothly, that they could continue indefinitely. The enslaved people knew otherwise. They understood that change was coming, whether through escape or through the political upheaval that everyone could sense approaching. The question was not whether the system would end, but how and how much blood would be spilled in its ending. The events of 1859 shattered the careful structure Ezekiel Harrington had built. The collapse began not from external intervention, but from within the enslaved community itself, driven by desperation and rage that had built for more than a decade. On a February night, when the moon was barely a sliver in the sky, 3 enslaved women, Lydia, Rebecca, and Julia, made their attempt. Lydia was the woman William had first been paired with 11 years earlier. She had borne 5 children, all taken from her. Rebecca had been Benjamin's first mother. Julia had borne 3 children fathered by Edward. All 3 women were in their late 20s or early 30s. All 3 had reached a point where death seemed preferable to continuing their existence on the Harrington plantation. They left separately to avoid suspicion, planning to meet 2 miles north at a creek crossing they had scouted during previous Sunday walks to the neighboring plantation's church services. The plan was to follow the creek north, travel only at night, head toward North Carolina, and then possibly further north. Elias had provided them with the little information he had gathered about routes and contacts. They made it 6 miles before being discovered missing at morning roll call. Ezekiel immediately sent William and Edward with 2 trusted enslaved trackers and dogs to hunt them down. The dogs picked up the scent quickly. The women were found hiding in a ravine by early afternoon. They had no weapons, no real chance of escape.
they were brought back to the plantation in chains. Ezekiel ordered a public punishment. Every enslaved person on the plantation was required to watch. The 3 women were whipped, 10 lashes each, tied to posts in the yard between the main house and the quarters. Abigail watched from the porch. The children watched from windows. The screams carried across the fields. After the whipping, Ezekiel made a speech. He stood before the assembled enslaved people and explained that the women had been ungrateful, had rejected the good treatment they received on his plantation, had attempted theft, for they were stealing themselves, which was theft of his property. He warned that any future escape attempts would be punished more severely. He reminded them that they were fortunate to be on the Harrington plantation rather than somewhere with harsher conditions. The speech was met with silence. The enslaved people stood motionless, faces carefully blank, revealing nothing. But inside, the hatred intensified. Lydia, Rebecca, and Julia were locked in a small storage building for 3 days with minimal food and water, then returned to work. Lydia could barely walk for weeks due to infection in the whipping wounds. Rebecca developed a fever that lasted for days. Julia survived physically, but something had broken in her mentally. She worked mechanically, responded when spoken to, but the light had gone from her eyes. Benjamin Harrington witnessed the whipping from his bedroom window. He was drunk, as he was nearly every afternoon by that point. The sight of the women being punished, women he had been forced to rape repeatedly by his father's system, triggered something. That evening, Benjamin confronted his father in the study. The argument was loud enough to be heard throughout the house. Benjamin accused his father of cruelty, of creating a system of horror, of destroying everyone it touched, including his own children. Ezekiel responded with cold fury. He told Benjamin he was weak, ungrateful, a disappointment. He told him that if he could not fulfill his duties as a son, he would be cut off from the family entirely. Benjamin shouted that he would rather be cut off than continue participating in the breeding program. Ezekiel struck him. The blow knocked Benjamin to the floor. Ezekiel stood over his son and told him that he would continue his duties or leave the plantation immediately with nothing. Benjamin left. He walked out of the house that night, took a horse from the barn, and rode toward Charleston. He never returned to the Harrington plantation. Benjamin's departure shocked the family. Abigail wept, more from embarrassment than grief. William increased his work to compensate for Benjamin's absence. Catherine retreated further into silence. Edward and Victoria seemed unaffected, continuing their roles in the system without comment. Ezekiel refused to speak of Benjamin, forbidding anyone from mentioning his name. But Benjamin's confrontation exposed the reality they all knew but never acknowledged. The system was built on violence, on the destruction of human souls, and it was destroying the Harrington family as surely as it destroyed the enslaved people they brutalized. Spring brought more trouble. Several enslaved children fell ill with measles, an outbreak that spread quickly through the crowded quarters. 2 children died. One of them was a 4-year-old girl named Clara, who had been fathered by William. It was the first time one of the children directly descended from the family had died on the plantation. Ezekiel noted the death in his ledger as a financial loss. William said nothing publicly, but he attended the child's burial in the slave cemetery, standing at a distance, watching as the small body was lowered into the ground. Catherine became pregnant again in April. This was her 6th pregnancy, and her psychological state had deteriorated so severely that Abigail began to worry she might not survive childbirth. Catherine barely ate, spent hours staring out her bedroom window, flinched when anyone approached. Abigail tried various tonics and treatments, but nothing helped. Catherine was trapped in a nightmare of her parents' creation, and there was no escape.
In May, Elias and 4 other enslaved men made their escape attempt. They were better prepared than the women had been. They had gathered supplies secretly over months: food, tools, a stolen knife. They left on a Saturday night when the White family was asleep and made it almost 20 meters before being discovered missing on Sunday morning. Ezekiel sent William and Edward with a larger party to search. This time, the search took 3 days. Elias's group had split up, making tracking harder. Eventually, all 5 were captured separately and brought back. The punishment was brutal. Ezekiel had them whipped severely, 20 lashes each. Elias, as the leader, received 30. Then Ezekiel did something he had never done before. He sold all 5 men immediately to a slave trader who transported them to Georgia sugar plantations, where working conditions were notoriously harsh and life expectancy was short. He wanted to send a message that escape attempts would result not just in punishment, but in exile to worse situations. The sale of Elias and the others devastated the enslaved community. Elias had been a leader, someone people looked to for hope. His removal left a void, but it also confirmed what everyone already knew. There was no mercy on the Harrington plantation, no recognition of their humanity, no limit to the suffering that would be inflicted to maintain the system. Catherine went into labor in late July. The birth was difficult and prolonged. Abigail attended her along with an enslaved midwife named Beatrice, who had delivered dozens of babies on the plantation. Catherine screamed for hours. The baby, when it finally came, was a boy. She held him for perhaps 30 seconds before losing consciousness. She did not wake up. She died 2 hours later from blood loss and complication. Catherine's death struck the family in ways that previous suffering had not. She was one of their own, a white woman, a daughter. Her death could not be dismissed or rationalized away. Abigail collapsed in grief. William and Edward stood in shocked silence. Victoria locked herself in her room. Ezekiel retreated to his study. The funeral was held 3 days later. Catherine was buried in the family cemetery on the plantation, marked with a proper stone. The Presbyterian minister gave a eulogy about God's mysterious ways and the consolation of faith. Neighboring plantation families attended and offered condolences. No one mentioned the circumstances of Catherine's pregnancy or the system that had contributed to her death. Just when we had seen it all, the horror in Beaufort County intensifies. If this story has given you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The baby Catherine had died delivering survived. Ezekiel named him Matthew and had him sent to the quarters to be raised by Miriam, along with all the other children born from the breeding program. The boy's existence was a reminder of Catherine's death, and the family wanted him out of sight. After Catherine's funeral, something shifted in Abigail. She had been an active participant in the breeding program, had supervised pregnancies, had enforced her husband's rules without visible guilt. But her daughter's death broke through the psychological barriers she had constructed. She began to question quietly whether what they had done was worth the cost. She did not express this to Ezekiel. He would have dismissed it as grief-induced weakness. But she confided in Victoria that she wondered if God was punishing them. Victoria, the youngest daughter, did not share her mother's doubts. At 20 years old, she was the most thoroughly indoctrinated of all the Harrington children. She had never known a world different from the one her parents created. Catherine's death saddened her, but she did not connect it to the breeding program. To Victoria, it was simply the danger of childbirth that all women faced. She continued her participation without hesitation, becoming pregnant again in September of 1859. William, now 28 years old, and effectively managing the plantation in his father's stead as Ezekiel grew older and more withdrawn, began to recognize the unsustainability of the system. Not from moral awakening, William had been too thoroughly shaped by his upbringing for that, but from practical observation. The enslaved population was growing increasingly hostile. Productivity in the fields had declined. The atmosphere of resentment and fear was palpable. The cotton yields were not matching the increased labor force. Something had to change.
But William had no idea what form that change should take. The autumn of 1859 brought news from the outside world that would eventually end the Harrington breeding program, though they did not know it yet. In October, a man named John Brown led a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, attempting to start a slave rebellion. The raid failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But the incident sent shockwaves through the South. Plantation owners everywhere tightened security, increased patrols, and viewed their enslaved people with heightened suspicion. Ezekiel responded by implementing stricter controls on the Harrington plantation. No enslaved person could leave the property for any reason, even the supervised church visits on Sundays. Evening curfew was moved earlier. The number of white overseers was increased from 2 to 4. Men hired from town to patrol the quarters and fields. Armed with rifles and whips, the plantation began to feel like a prison, which in truth it had always been. But now the bars were visible, and the guards were everywhere.
The increased security made life even more unbearable for the enslaved people. They could not gather in groups larger than 5 without an overseer demanding to know what they were discussing. Their cabins were searched randomly for any contraband, tools that might be used as weapons, food that might be stored for escape attempts, anything that suggested independent thought or planning. Punishments for minor infractions became more severe. A man named Robert was whipped for talking back to an overseer. A woman named Dinah was locked in the storage shed for 2 days for being late to fieldwork. The pressure was building toward an explosion, and in December of 1859, it came. On the night of December 18th, a Sunday, when the white family was asleep and the overseers were making their rounds at the far end of the property, fire broke out in the cotton gin building. The flames spread quickly, fed by stored cotton and dried wood. By the time anyone noticed, the entire structure was engulfed. The alarm was raised. Everyone, white family, overseers, enslaved people, rushed to fight the fire, forming bucket lines from the well, desperately trying to prevent the flames from spreading to other buildings. They saved the main house and the barn, but the cotton gin burned to the ground, along with a significant portion of the stored cotton waiting to be processed. The financial loss was devastating, but more significant was what Ezekiel found the next morning when he inspected the ruins. Evidence that the fire had been deliberately set. Remnants of oil-soaked rags placed strategically to maximize damage. Ezekiel immediately ordered an investigation. He gathered all the enslaved people and demanded to know who had set the fire. No one spoke. He threatened mass punishment. Silence. He had the overseers search the quarters, looking for any evidence, any indication of guilt. Nothing was found. Frustrated and enraged, Ezekiel selected 3 men at random, Peter, Moses, and James, and had them whipped as an example, 20 lashes each in front of the assembled enslaved population. He told everyone that until someone confessed, random punishments would continue. He would destroy them all, if necessary, to find the guilty party. But no one confessed, because everyone was guilty. The fire had been set by a group of 7 people working together, carefully chosen for their trustworthiness and their shared determination. They had planned it for weeks, waiting for the right moment. The fire was not meant to kill anyone. It was set at night when the building was empty, but to strike at Ezekiel's wealth, to cost him money, to demonstrate that they were not completely powerless. The fire marked a turning point. The enslaved community had moved from passive resistance and escape attempts to active sabotage. They understood that they could hurt their oppressor even if they could not free themselves. Over the following months, other incidents occurred.
tools went missing. A fence critical for containing livestock was damaged, allowing pigs to escape. A supply of seed corn stored for spring planting was found contaminated with dirt. Ezekiel responded with increasingly harsh measures, but each punishment only deepened the resentment and determination. The plantation had become a war zone, though the war was largely invisible to outside observers. To neighboring plantation owners, the Harrington property still appeared prosperous and well managed. They noticed the burned cotton gin, but fires were not uncommon on plantations. They had no idea of the seething conflict beneath the surface. William tried to counsel his father toward moderation, not from compassion, but from pragmatism. The harsh punishments were making the enslaved people less productive, more dangerous. But Ezekiel would not hear it. He had spent 24 years building his system, and he would not abandon it now. The breeding program would continue. Control would be maintained. His will would prevail. Abigail, meanwhile, had retreated almost entirely from active participation in plantation management. Catherine's death had broken something in her that would not heal. She spent her days in her room reading scripture, praying, writing letters to her sister in Georgia that revealed a mind slowly fragmenting under the weight of guilt she could no longer suppress. In one letter from January 1860, she wrote, "I fear we have sinned greatly, and God's judgment approaches. My daughter is dead. My son is lost to drink and exile, and I wake each night hearing screams that may be real or may be echoes of all the years past." Victoria gave birth to her second child in February 1860, a girl like Catherine before her. Victoria was immediately expected to resume her participation in the breeding program. Unlike Catherine, Victoria showed no signs of psychological distress. She had been too young when the program began, had absorbed her parents' worldview too completely to develop the moral conflict that had destroyed her sister and brother. Victoria was, in some ways, the program's greatest success and its most horrifying product. A person so thoroughly indoctrinated that she felt no guilt for participating in systemic rape and enslavement. As winter turned to spring in 1860, political tensions between North and South reached a breaking point. Abraham Lincoln's presidential campaign, with its platform opposing the expansion of slavery into new territories, was seen by many Southerners as an existential threat. Plantation owners throughout South Carolina began discussing secession, preparing for possible conflict. Ezekiel attended meetings in Port Royal, where local leaders debated their response to Northern aggression, as they termed it. Ezekiel was consumed with defending slavery in the abstract, the Southern way of life, states' rights, property rights, while being blind to the specific horrors he had created on his own plantation.
He could give passionate speeches about the biblical justification for slavery, about the economic necessity of the institution, about the supposed happiness of enslaved people under benevolent masters, while forcing his own children to rape women he owned and separating mothers from babies. The cognitive dissonance never seemed to register. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. South Carolina seceded from the Union in December. South Carolina followed in January 1861. By February, 7 Southern states had formed the Confederate States of America. War was coming, though few people in early 1861 believed it would last long or cost much blood. The prevailing opinion in South Carolina was that the North would back down, that Southerners' superior military tradition would ensure quick victory, that the world would not allow the cotton supply to be disrupted. The Harrington Plantation continued its operations through these political upheavals, but the approaching war created uncertainty. William and Edward were of military age and would likely be expected to fight. The plantation's workforce might be reduced if enslaved men were impressed into service building fortifications or working for the Confederate Army. The breeding program, which had been the focus of family efforts for more than 2 decades, suddenly seemed less important than survival in a changing world. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Civil War began. William enlisted in a South Carolina regiment within weeks. Edward followed in May. Ezekiel, at 53 years old, was too old for military service. He remained on the plantation with Abigail, Victoria, the hired overseers, and the enslaved population of 73 people, a population that included dozens of children fathered by the Harrington men. With William and Edward gone, the day-to-day management of the plantation fell to Ezekiel and the overseers. The breeding program continued, but with less intensity and organization. Ezekiel was aging, increasingly plagued by health problems. Abigail was barely functional, spending most of her time in her room. Victoria managed the household, but had neither the authority nor the inclination to oversee field operations. The war years were chaotic. The Union blockade of southern ports made it difficult to sell cotton. Confederate currency became increasingly worthless. Food supplies were diverted to feed the army. The plantation began to decline. Buildings needed repairs that were not made. Fields were planted and harvested, but the work was done with less supervision and increasing resentment. The enslaved people on the Harrington plantation heard rumors of Union advances, of enslaved people escaping to Union lines and gaining freedom, of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Hope began to replace despair. They understood that the world was changing, that the system that had held them in bondage was collapsing. They waited. William Harrington was killed at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Edward died of dysentery in a military camp in Virginia in 1863. Both deaths devastated Ezekiel. His sons, whom he had raised to inherit and continue his plantation empire, were gone. His dream of a multi-generational dynasty built on the breeding program died with them. Abigail died in her sleep in August 1864. The doctor said it was heart failure, but it might more accurately have been described as the final collapse of a woman who had lived too long with guilt she could acknowledge, but not escape. She was buried next to Catherine in the family cemetery. By early 1865, the Harrington plantation was a shadow of what it had been. Ezekiel was 67 years old, in failing health, increasingly confused. Victoria, now 26, managed what she could, but the situation was beyond her control. The enslaved people were barely working, waiting for the Union Army that everyone knew was coming. The overseers had left, either to join the army or to flee north. The plantation buildings were deteriorating. The fields were partially planted, but poorly tended. In April 1865, news reached Beaufort County that the Confederate Army had surrendered. The war was over. Slavery was ended. The world the Harringtons had built and defended was gone. Union troops arrived in Port Royal in May. An officer came to the Harrington plantation to inform Ezekiel and Victoria that the enslaved people were now free. Ezekiel, weakened by stroke and confined to a wheelchair, could barely comprehend what he was being told. Victoria understood but refused to accept it. She argued with the officer, insisted that the people on the plantation were her property, demanded compensation for the loss. The officer explained that there would be no compensation, that slavery was abolished by constitutional amendment, that she needed to accept reality. The formerly enslaved people of the Harrington plantation gathered their belongings and left. Some went immediately, walking away the same day they learned of their freedom. Others stayed for weeks, unsure where to go or how to survive in a world they had never known as free people. By July, only a handful remained, mostly elderly people who had nowhere else to go. Lydia, the first woman forced into the breeding program, left with her surviving children. She walked north, eventually reaching Savannah, Georgia, where she found work as a washerwoman and lived until 1889. Rebecca went west toward Augusta with her children. Julia, who had never recovered psychologically from the trauma of her years on the plantation, stayed for several months, unable to make the decision to leave until other freed people finally convinced her to come with them to a Freedmen's Bureau camp where she might receive help. The children fathered by the Harrington men, those who survived to see freedom, scattered.
Most took names different from Harrington, wanting no association with their father's family. Some became farmers, working their own land. Some moved to cities. A few managed to get education and became teachers or ministers. They carried the trauma of their origins throughout their lives, but they were free. Ezekiel Harrington died in October 1865. The cause was listed as complications from stroke. But more fundamentally, he died because the world he understood had ended, and he could not adapt. He was buried in the family cemetery next to Abigail and Catherine. No one mourned except Victoria. Victoria tried to maintain the plantation after her father's death, but it was impossible. She had no workforce, no money, no credit. The cotton gin had never been rebuilt after the fire. The buildings continued to deteriorate. In 1867, she sold the property for a fraction of its former value to a northern investor who planned to divide it into smaller farms to be worked by free labor. Victoria used the money to move to Mobile, Alabama, where she lived with distant relatives. She never married, never spoke publicly about the plantation or her family, and died in 1891 at age 52. Benjamin Harrington, the son who had fled the plantation in 1859, survived the war years, working various jobs in Charleston and New Orleans under an assumed name. He never stopped drinking. He died of liver failure in 1872, estranged from his remaining family, leaving no heirs and few possessions. His death went largely unnoticed. The Harrington plantation itself was divided into 4 separate farms by 1870. The main house, stripped of its furnishings and left abandoned, slowly collapsed over the following decades. By 1900, nothing remained but the foundation stones and a few outbuildings. The slave quarters rotted and fell. The family cemetery, overgrown and neglected, became difficult to find. The cotton gin site was plowed under and planted with crops. The children born from the breeding program and their descendants spread throughout the South and eventually across the country. Most never knew the full story of their origins. The trauma was too great to speak of, and the surviving mothers who had endured the program rarely told their children the details of their conception. The secret was buried with each generation. The Harrington ledgers, which documented the breeding program in meticulous detail, survived by accident. They were stored in a locked trunk that ended up in the possession of a descendant of Abigail's sister in Georgia. That descendant, cleaning out an attic in 1962, discovered the trunk and the ledgers inside. Shocked by what they revealed, the descendant donated them to a university archive, where they became available to historians researching the realities of slavery. Those ledgers, along with scattered letters, county records, and oral histories eventually collected from descendants of enslaved people who survived the Harrington plantation, provide the evidence for what occurred. The story is documented, verifiable, and profoundly disturbing. The Harrington case was not unique. Historical research has revealed numerous instances of plantation owners forcing enslaved women into sexual relationships, of systematic breeding programs designed to increase enslaved populations, of families participating in these practices across generations. What makes the Harrington case notable is the documentation, the cold, detailed records that Ezekiel kept, treating human reproduction as livestock management. The psychological impact on everyone involved was devastating. The enslaved women who were raped repeatedly, who bore children they were not allowed to raise, who lived in constant fear and degradation, suffered trauma that affected them for the rest of their lives and was passed down to their children. The Harrington children, raised in a system of systemic abuse, were themselves damaged beyond repair. William and Edward died young in a war defending the system that had poisoned their souls. Benjamin drank himself to death, trying to escape his guilt. Catherine died giving birth to her 6th child from the breeding program. Victoria lived longer, but never found peace or happiness. Abigail and Ezekiel, the architects of the system, lived long enough to see it collapse, but never acknowledged the evil they had created. They died believing they had been good Christians, responsible plantation owners, victims of northern aggression and economic forces beyond their control. They never accepted moral responsibility for the suffering they caused. The most chilling aspect of the Harrington case is how normal they appeared to their contemporaries. Church members who knew them for decades described Ezekiel as a devoted family man and Abigail as a pious woman who read scripture daily. Business associates considered Ezekiel honest in his dealings, prompt in paying debts, reliable in his contracts. Neighbors saw the Harrington family as pillars of their community. No one intervened because no one believed intervention was necessary. The horror was hidden in plain sight, protected by the legal framework of slavery and the social conventions that prevented questions about what happened on a man's property. The enslaved people who survived the Harrington plantation carried their trauma silently for years after emancipation. In the 1930s, when the Federal Writers Project conducted interviews with formerly enslaved people as part of documenting American history, several individuals who had lived on the Harrington plantation were interviewed.
Their testimonies, recorded in aged voices but with vivid memories, confirmed the breeding program's existence. An elderly woman named Patience, who had been born on the plantation in 1854, told her interviewer, "Mr. Harrington, he run that place like he was God himself. He decided who born, who live, who sold away. His own children did what he said, every one of 'em. We wasn't people to them, we was crops they was growing." These oral histories, preserved in Library of Congress archives, corroborate the documentary evidence found in the ledgers. What happened on the Harrington plantation between 1835 and 1865 was legal under the laws of South Carolina and the Confederate States. That is perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. Ezekiel Harrington was never charged with a crime, never investigated by authorities, never held accountable in any legal sense. The system of slavery gave him absolute power over the people he owned, and he used that power to create a nightmare that lasted 3 decades. His family participated willingly, shaped by their upbringing, into believing that their actions were not just permissible, but admirable, a demonstration of business acumen and family loyalty. The Harrington breeding program was slavery, operating exactly as the system was designed to operate, reducing human beings to property, stripping them of agency, exploiting them for profit, and destroying them without consequence. The children born from the breeding program numbered at least 47, according to Ezekiel's ledgers, though the actual number may have been higher, as some births likely went unrecorded, particularly those that resulted in infant deaths. Of those 47 documented children, approximately 30 survived to see emancipation. Their descendants today number in the hundreds, spread across the United States, most unaware of their connection to the Harrington plantation or the circumstances of their ancestors' births. DNA testing in recent years has confirmed genetic links between individuals descended from the enslaved population and individuals descended from the Harrington family, providing scientific verification of what the historical records already documented. Some descendants have sought each other out, creating connections across racial lines born from shared trauma. Others prefer not to know, finding the truth too painful to confront.